and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about theology, but try to do that in an interesting way. Now, it should be interesting to everyone, but I understand only so well as an individual that has been sitting in classrooms and teaching in classrooms about some of the things that we're going to discuss. Sometimes it can seem completely overwhelming and maybe too academic. Sometimes maybe it seems a little bit boring. But if you think about this, historically, understanding God and understanding how to take the Word of God and apply it to every area of life is something that has been part of the Christian life for a very long time. Yet somewhere we made it a little too academic and maybe a little too sterile. Oftentimes I've had people say, I appreciate theology, but it's all God talk. It's about theology, Christology, maybe ecclesiology. The only time it seems to even possibly be relevant to my day-to-day world is maybe when we get into eschatology. And I think that's unfortunate, because what we're going to try to do today in this hour is just spend a little bit of time maybe seeing if we can learn some theological insights through the lives of some of the characters in the Bible. And I think you're going to find that to be very helpful and maybe something that would cause you to want to get a copy of this book, Walking the Theological Life, Discovering Method for Theology in the Lives of Biblical Characters. It is written by Dr. Timothy Gaines, has his Ph.D. from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. He's an associate professor of religion at Trevecca Nazarene University. He teaches both theology and ethics, also directs the graduate program there in theology and biblical studies. You may have come across some of his books, for example, Christian Ethics, Following Jesus, Prophet, Priest, and King, some that get into the political issues that we talk about so often here on Point of View, Kings and Presidents, Politics in the Kingdom of God, and another one, A Seat at the Table, A Generation Reimagining Its Place in the Church. Topics many times that we've addressed here on Point of View. And we're going to work our way through this book. It is published by our good friends at InterVarsity Press. We have information about him and the book on the website at pointofview.net. So Dr. Timothy Gaines, welcome to Point of View.
Thank you for having me. Truly grateful for the opportunity to talk through this.
Let's, if we can, talk about how you teach theology and how sometimes you recognize that your young students, and maybe sometimes you even have some older students that come back to get some theological education, have difficulty kind of getting their head around it. And one of the things that attracted me about the book is the idea of trying to make it relevant to the day-to-day, because quite frankly now, oftentimes when we want to make theology relevant to the day-to-day, we call it Christian worldview. And so we here on Point of View talk about worldview issues, or we interview people from the Colson Center, or we talk with individuals that do apologetics. And I think we've, in some respects, disconnected what is theology proper and theology that helps us in the day-to-day world. Don't you think?
Yeah, I absolutely do. But I just wonder why we've done that when God is alive. So sometimes theology gets this reputation that we're studying something that's not alive. Like we approach the study of God, which is really what theology is properly. It is the study of God. But what difference does it make that God is alive and knows us, that God is living and God is active? That's very different than the way we might approach the study of something that is not alive, that doesn't know us. It's very different than geology or other kinds of sciences that would look at things that are not alive. So that's the primary question that I bring to this. I sometimes want to ask people, how is it that we have squeezed the life out of theology when God is alive? This ought to be thrilling and mystifying and challenging and alluring to us all at the same time, because this is the God who not only is alive, but is active and knows us.
Again, your students are really benefiting from the kind of enthusiasm that you have and from your teaching. And I might just mention that we're going to, if we have time, talk about 12 different individuals. But I like at one point where you said, how did I choose these? Well, you could choose anyone's, but you say, I see my insecurity in Jeremiah. Like Martha, I've known grief. I resonate with Thomas's doubt. I see Miriam's courage. With Jacob, I wrestle. And you say, taken together, this is a company of often unsaintly saints who issue permission to reply to God with a full-bodied response. And so, in some respects, you could have picked a different dozen, but these dozen illustrate a lot of different characteristics, from doubt to courage to morality to grieving. And in some respects, that's why you chose these, isn't it?
That's exactly right. And walking through Scripture, I realized that most of the time, people in Scripture are not responding to God by coming up with a bunch of ideas. They're responding with their whole selves. And there's something that we can learn about our own response to God from reading these passages like that. So I wanted to, in some sense, discover virtues that maybe the biblical writers have passed on to us, to say to the Christian community, hey, don't forget about this. Don't just have an idea in mind. Think about the way that Jeremiah was humble as a virtue, or that Jacob refused to give up as a virtue, or the way that Sarah would laugh as a kind of virtue. And that as we employ these virtues, we might actually be able to know something of God that we wouldn't have been able to know without those virtues. I think theology oftentimes doesn't pay enough attention to who we are as people. It pays a lot of attention to how we do the task, but not who we are as people. And it seems to me that the Scriptures are speaking to us about actual people and who they are. And so they're bringing their whole selves to this task of theology. And that opens up a whole new way to be able to know God. So you're exactly right. As I was reading through the Bible, I thought, who are the characters I resonate with most deeply? And as I'm writing through, I was going through grief, and I was learning how to laugh in new ways, and I was exploring all kinds of new things about what it means to be in this stage of life as a parent, and what it means to be a husband, and those kinds of things. And these are the characters that jumped out the most.
Well, let me just mention, we're going to go to a break. When we come back, we'll work our way through some of those. Jeremiah, Jacob, Sarah, Moses, Miriam, Isaiah, Mary, John the Baptist, the woman who anointed Jesus, Thomas, Mary and Martha, Nicodemus. And when we come back, we'll talk about Jeremiah. Of course, you begin by talking about Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And that's a verse I use oftentimes when we're talking about pro-life issues. But that's really just a setup for the statement that he makes later on, and that is, I cannot speak. I'm only a boy. I certainly don't have any kind of ability. And yet then we can begin to address that issue. So we'll come back and we'll spend some time, first of all, talking about Jeremiah. We'll pick out just a few of the others, but this is a book, as we mentioned before, published by InterVarsity Press, about 200 pages, and it is paperback. And if you find yourself wanting to get a copy, might be able to find it in your local bookstore. But as you well know, if you simply go to the website here, we have a link to his website, which will give you information about him. And right beneath that is a place for you to get a copy of the book if you would like. It is both in paperback and Kindle, and it is something we'll try to work through in this hour as we try to explore theology almost vicariously through some of these biblical characters. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Pundits and politicians have spent decades lamenting the erosion of the middle class. They point to rising prices in America while many jobs were being sent overseas. While some in the middle class improved their financial status and became part of the upper class, many more discovered that the goalposts moved. Compare 1975 to 2025. Families with an annual income of $100,000 5 decades ago were doing well. Today, $100,000 makes it difficult to survive. When the United States went off the gold standard in 1971, the money supply increased from less than $1 trillion in 1975 to $22 trillion in 2025. While it is true that the population increased, the money supply grew 4 times faster than the population. That is correct. It meant that every dollar you earned was competing with a flood of money that was slowly devaluing the dollars in your pocket. Sometimes the flood of money came quickly. In 2008, we had a banking and housing crisis. Congress and the Federal Reserve swooped in to save banks by printing money. In 2020, we had a pandemic and lockdown. Once again, money printing was supposed to save Americans, but it was also devaluing the dollars in your pocket. Median household income in 1975 was $11,000 and rose to $83,000 in 2025. That increase in 5 decades looks good until you compare it to the rising costs due to the devalued dollar. Put simply, wages have underperformed during this period. The solution to this middle-class meltdown is to fix the money and thereby fix the economy. This 50-year comparison illustrates what's been happening in our world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we spend a little bit of time looking at theology through the lives of some of these biblical characters, talking about this book, Walking the Theological Life. Timothy Gaines with us. And Timothy, if we can, let's get to Jeremiah on not knowing how to speak. Now, we could have talked about Lamentations or something else, but as you pointed out a minute ago, Jeremiah gives us a view of somebody who is humble, but more than that, feels inadequate to actually do what God has called him to do. And I would say that many people tell me that their greatest fear is public speaking. Now, you and I do it for a living, but I understand that only so well. And here you have Jeremiah saying, who am I to do this? Why are you even suggesting that I can do this? Because I'm only a boy. And God comes back with, well, I have put words in your mouth. And so there's some great lessons we can learn there, can't we?
Absolutely right. And the other part of that captures me is that God speaks to Jeremiah and says, I've known you from even before you were in the womb, which is striking to me because if theology oftentimes is cast as our attempt to know God, what does it mean? And how would it change our approach to theology if we recognize that God has known us first, long before we can know anything about God? And Kerby, I think part of my concern around theology these days is setting it up as some kind of an enterprise where people who want to do theology say, look at all the things that I know about God, without first acknowledging, like Jeremiah, wait a minute, God knew me first. And that ought to put us in a position of first being known by God and then proceeding. So sometimes when I'm trying to shape the hearts of people who want to do theology for a living, I say, you need to put yourself in Jeremiah's shoes first. Embody the virtue that we see in Jeremiah's life of being satisfied to be known by God before you seek to go out and know something about God.
Well said. Again, there are so many great illustrations in each one of these, and each chapter ends with a prayer and then questions for discussion or reflection. So I might just mention later as we talk about how people can use this. I think some of you that have a small group and are looking for a discussion, this might be exactly what you're looking for. But since we're talking about this idea of humility, uncertainty, and the rest, it kind of flows naturally into Jacob wrestling over all sorts of issues. Sometimes people are dealing with grief or pain, or later we'll get to Thomas dealing with doubt. And here, I think there's some lessons that we can learn about the struggle and about wrestling, can't we?
I do think that Jacob sets up for us a virtue of meeting God and knowing something about God by refusing to let go in the midst of a wrestling match. It's interesting to me that in Genesis, Jacob comes away from that wrestling match there at the banks of the river, believing he's met God, even though the biblical text never says, this is God. I find that to be infinitely interesting because Jacob, I think, has learned something. He has met God, and yet he refuses to let go. And so for my own journey, and this is a book, I think, for people, not just professional theologians or students of theology, but people who are just walking through life and seeking to know God more deeply, more virtuously. I was walking through a grief struggle in my life where I was overtaken seemingly in the middle of the night by a grief journey, losing a family member very suddenly. And that was shocking to me. And by refusing to let go of the situations like Jacob does, I think that I knew something more about God walking through that grief journey because I refused to let go. I'm not going to let go until I have met God in the midst of this wrestling match. That was profound. And I find Jacob to be a very convincing and capable partner on that journey.
We oftentimes learn a lot more about our Christian life and about ourselves when we go through difficult pain, suffering, grief, of those kinds of issues. And so maybe to lighten it up for just a minute, one of the chapters is on Sarah, on laughter. And you talk about the fact that if we can learn to laugh with Sarah, a host of theological discoveries await us that rationally chosen words alone may not be able to access. I suspect that would strike some people as a little bit unusual, so I'm going to let you explain.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we drive a wedge between what is funny and what is serious, because if something is serious, it can't be funny. And so I've tried to develop this new approach in this chapter to say, no, this is seriously funny. We take our faith seriously, but our faith is also, I think, what allows us to laugh at the world, largely because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so in this chapter, I try to suggest that the resurrection of Jesus is the punchline that God is playing on death and evil and destruction in the world. It's the punchline that nobody really saw coming. And when we think about it, the things that oftentimes make us laugh are the punchlines that we just didn't see coming. It's like the things that take us by surprise.
Oh, yes.
The first time that I made my baby son laugh by putting a piece of paper up in front of my face and then withdrawing it very quickly. And he was kind of surprised for a moment and then recognized my face. And that was his first laugh. And I thought, what if Sarah has something to teach to us about laughter, about how laughter allows us to see the things that God is doing in the world that just sheer rationality wouldn't necessarily be able to do. And when she receives the news that as a very old woman, she's going to bear a child, that's surprising. That is laughter inducing. And so I wondered, could it be that she has something to teach us about receiving laughter as an arena, as a virtue of meeting God, and maybe incorporating that into our walk as Christians?
One of the things I loved about your chapter is just to show that theologians have a sense of humor. You say, I remember the day my 93-year-old grandmother announced to the family that she had recently been cast in the church play as Sarah. My 60-something dad's face lit up and said, all right, I'm finally going to get a brother. And I'm sure the laughter that came around after that is just a good illustration of the fact that we don't always have to be serious. And I think some of the great teachers of God's Word, I think of Chuck Swindoll, for example, and many others that have such a great sense of humor. I think that's illustrative as well. I thought I'd also, just for a minute, have you talk about Moses on morality, because we obviously think about Moses and Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, and we think about all of that, but there are some lessons to be learned there as well, isn't there?
That's absolutely right. We oftentimes associate Moses, of course, with the Ten Commandments, which is ground zero in many ways for Christian morality. And yet, I'm trying to help us remember in this chapter that didn't just come out of the blue. That in many ways, the people had met with God at Sinai. And out of that meeting, out of this incredibly dynamic relationship, comes the Ten Commandments that allow us to live in relationship to God, but that these are not just arbitrary moral commands. And so that when it comes to morality in the Christian life, there always needs to be that component that we are responding to God, not just living to moral codes that aren't connected in some sense to the God who is alive.
Well, we need to take a break, and so we will do that. But let me just mention already, as we've gone through a few of these, that, of course, we've talked about Jeremiah on not knowing how to speak, or Jacob on wrestling, Sarah on laughter, Moses on morality. We'll get into some of the others, Miriam on courage, Isaiah on being undone. Of course, you see that in these opening chapters there as well. Mary, the mother of Jesus, on pondering, John the Baptist on standing on the edge, the woman who anointed Jesus on love, Thomas on doubting, Mary and Martha on grieving, and Nicodemus on theology at night and leadership in the dark, just to give you a few illustrations of this book, which as I mentioned before, is one that probably would be very helpful to you if you wanted to maybe dig a little deeper, or if you were even maybe going to be teaching on that particular section of Scripture to maybe discern some of the insights. But as I also pointed out, each one of the chapters have a number of key insights. It closes with a suggested prayer, and then usually with about 3 questions to begin a conversation or a discussion on reflection. So this certainly could be a book that you might want to read on your own, but I also just want to alert some of you that are small group leaders, life group leaders, small group coordinators, whatever it might be, to know that this is something that might be helpful. Timothy Gaines really helps us understand this issue of theology, really trying to make it a little more relevant. It's more than just an academic pursuit. It really is an attempt to explore some of the lives of some of these key biblical characters, watching them walk through this particular theological path and see if we can learn some lessons vicariously from them and maybe grow in our understanding. So again, the book is entitled Walking the Theological Life, Discovering Method for Theology in the Lives of Biblical Characters. It's published by our good friends at InterVarsity Press, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about Timothy Gaines or this book, you can simply go to our website, which is pointofview.net. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
In 19th century London, 2 towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk about the book, Walking the Theological Life, Discovering Method for Theology in the Lives of Biblical Characters. Timothy Gaines with me. And Timothy, for just a minute, we might talk about how people can use this book. I've already suggested that people could go through it either individually, and thus the questions in the back of each chapter are for reflection, or they could go through it collectively with a small group, and those questions then could stimulate a discussion.
Absolutely. I've written it for both. I've heard from lots of folks who said my small group has gone through this together. There are questions that are designed to get you going, and I've tried to choose biblical characters that are relatable to people in various stages of life. There's men and women represented in here. It's It's really for the person who is looking to grow in their capacity to know God well and virtuously, and looking for guidance on how we can do that, whether you're doing that in an academic setting or whether you're doing that in a small group setting.
Well, let's see if we can continue on. One of the chapters is on Miriam, on courage. Now, you could have used Joshua for courage, but I think in some respects people might be able to relate to someone who's not seen as David or a warrior or Joshua or something like that. But here, courage is in short supply. It's a chapter that we desperately need in this 21st century world, and that's why you included her in that particular section as well.
I am absolutely struck by the image of Miriam picking up the tambourine and singing as the people of God are moving into the wilderness, because the wilderness is this vast unknown. And I was also entering into a season in my life where there was a lot of vast unknown in front of me. But what I love about Miriam is she begins to sing about what God has already done with the courage and confidence that God will continue to sustain them into the future. And I thought, that is a virtue that I need to embody in my own life. I need to learn something from Miriam on this. She sings of what God has done in the past that leads to courage in the future. And so this is, in many ways, my way of talking about eschatology and other related matters. That this is how theologians can approach this, that it's not just about only what's going to happen in the future, but the consistency of what God has done in the past that leads us to trust God into an unknown future.
Well, and you also talk about discerning courage, which is something we need to do, and even this idea of virtuous courage. So a lot in that chapter, but just to be fair to your book, I'll keep moving because that then takes us to perhaps one of the more famous passages where Isaiah is actually ushered into, if you will, the throne room. In Isaiah 6, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. My eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. And this one is Isaiah on being undone. If you can, explain to us this idea of being undone, because you do explore that for a little bit in this chapter.
Yeah, certainly. Beginning point of exploring who God is in relationship to a God who is alive. Isaiah encounters that firsthand. And I love the virtue that we pick up in him, that he doesn't kind of puff himself up, but he is humbled by that immediately. And then Isaiah, from that point forward, needs to go speak to his own people. His phrase in there, that I am a man of unclean lips and I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips, says to me that we cannot extract ourselves from the people we live with. And I think sometimes theologians have a little bit of an impulse to withdraw from the people we live among. And I want to say, no. Look at Isaiah's virtue. He is commissioned by God to go speak specifically to those people. And so look into the faces of the people you live among. Let's engage with our neighbors. Let's engage in our communities. Let's not withdraw into some place that doesn't include the people who God is calling us to speak to.
Wow. Well, I might just point out that the first 6 chapters deal with Old Testament characters. Now the rest deal with New Testament characters, and I appreciate the fact that you have a balance between the two. And one of those is about Mary, her encounter first with an angel, and then this whole idea of what this is going to mean to her. And then you talk about Mary on pondering, and even take us through what you might call the silence of praise. Can you explain?
Yeah, this is helpful coming out of the Christmas season where we've had a lot of attention on Mary and the birth of Jesus. And one of my favorite vignettes that Luke gives us is that in the midst of all of the busyness of the birth of Jesus, and you've got the shepherds coming, and then you've got the wise men coming, and then the shepherds are hurrying off. There's all this singing in the heavenly realms. Mary goes essentially silent there after the birth of Jesus. She's very vocal before the birth of Jesus. She sings out this song of praise that God would use her in this way. But then after the birth of Jesus, Luke is pretty insistent that she treasures things in her heart. She ponders. And I thought, what do I have to learn from Mary about knowing God by that? And the more you dig in, the more you realize that pondering opens the space to be able to see the amazing things that God is doing in the world if you'll give yourself the time and space to be able to do that. And I think for Mary, she is looking at the entrance of God into the world into very difficult, very hard circumstances and situations, and standing in amazement at what she's seeing unfold. I was convicted that I am probably not doing that enough in my life, and I probably am missing some of the things that God is doing in amazing ways because I am more caught up in the proclamation of the shepherds or the singing of the heavenly realm than I am in simply giving myself the time and space to ponder and treasure what it is that God is doing in front of us.
Probably need that even more because of this fast-paced, frenetic society in which we find ourselves in, dominated by cell phones and a variety of other issues. The pondering that I've seen people have, first time they've ever seen the Grand Canyon. Remember somebody that I knew from the Midwest, first time she sat on the ocean because she had never seen the Pacific Ocean. I mean, there are some senses in which you understand that in the natural world. Of course, Isaiah experienced it in the supernatural world. But I think it is interesting here that after all of this, again, in the last part of Luke chapter 2, and Mary treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart, which I thought is just a very significant lesson we need to learn as well. What about John the Baptist? You're talking about here on standing on the edge. Obviously, you have an individual that certainly is a witness to the light, as you say in John 1, and also an individual who baptized Jesus, loses, of course, his head later on, but there is a sense in which we can learn some very important vicarious lessons from John the Baptist.
Yeah, that's right. He's standing literally on the edge because the Jordan River is the boundary between the promised land and the wilderness.
Yeah.
And so as people are coming out of Jerusalem, they're coming out of the promised land to find him, he's this odd, prophetic, edgy character. And I thought, we've got something to learn about how to know God well from people who stand right there at the edge of these spaces where these two realities merge and come together and diverge and those kinds of things. And so as I've talked through this content with groups of pastors in particular, I've had lots of pastors who are working in hard situations, edgy situations, neighborhoods that don't look a lot like the settled territory, come to me afterwards and say, this is actually giving me a lot of hope and courage to know that I can meet God, that when Jesus goes out and is baptized at the edge of the wilderness there at the Jordan River, that's where the action is, that these people are coming out of the settled territory and meeting God in new and profound ways at the borderland of these two realities. And so oftentimes a lot of folks who are serving in those kinds of situations who are not just in the settled territory will feel a little bit alone, feel a little bit like where is God in all of this? And in fact, there is God in the midst of it, in the flesh of Jesus being baptized. And I thought John could see that well, and maybe he had some virtue to offer to us to be able to see that as well.
Well, and the other part of it I was thinking is imagine if John the Baptist were alive today. He's not, but just as a thought experiment, and he came to your church, where would the ushers have him sit? And would they violate one of the principles in the book of James, for example? I just think there's some really important aspects of this. Not only is there a place for me to minister to those in marginal areas, as you refer to it, or places where there is a great challenge, but also what it might mean in terms of our welcoming people into our congregation, in our community. So let's take a break. We've got a couple more. We'll see if we can bang out maybe 2 or 3 more. I don't know if we'll get all of them, but we certainly have done a pretty good job of giving you an overview of this book, Walking the Theological Life, Discovering Method for Theology in the Lives of Biblical Characters. And certainly, we want to talk about Thomas, and I think we have to talk about Mary and Martha, and we may not get to all the rest of those, but those at least are some very important principles that we can discern, again, from the lives of those biblical characters as we walk alongside them in their theological journey. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue the conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Timothy Gaines, Walking the Theological Life, and this chapter on Thomas on doubting. I knew that one had to be in there, but I also thought it was interesting, Timothy. It, I think maybe is your longest chapter, as illustrated by the fact that there are so many issues, and because this is a program where we do address issues like theology, apologetics, and worldview, you talk about the importance of asking honest questions, even trying to deconstruct doubt itself, and maybe to learn some questions and some principles from Thomas, who I'm so grateful he was there because he was asking the tough questions that we need to ask today here in the 21st century world.
Yeah, absolutely right. Sometimes I think Thomas unfortunately gets cast as only a doubter, but if we go through his whole journey in John's gospel, he shows up 3 times. And the first time we see him in chapter 11, he's willing to go die with Jesus. Let's go with him and die. And then we see him in chapter 14, and he's asking honest questions about how do we know? How do we know the way? And so when he shows up in chapter 20, I sometimes want to help recover his legacy to say that's not the only time he shows up in John's gospel. But we also have to think about what doubt is. And in English, it's a little bit tricky, largely because our word for doubt comes from Latin, but oftentimes the kinds of things that are being described in John's gospel are in Greek, and so those carry slightly different meanings. And so I don't know that we can always just equate those words identically. And so part of what I'm suggesting in that chapter is that doubt could be one thing. It's like waffling between 2 realities and never being willing to put your feet in one category long enough to be able to explore it, which I don't think is Thomas's issue. And so I take a look at that and say, what if Thomas actually opens the virtue to us of asking honest questions, committed questions, saying, I am willing to commit to Jesus, and I've got more questions. I want to explore further. I need to know more. And then maybe there's a virtue in that drive to want to know more, even from a place of commitment.
One of the things I appreciate you putting in there is that famous painting from Caravaggio, who actually shows Thomas and his encounter with the risen Christ. And here you have something which is very striking because you have his finger outstretched, penetrating the wound on the side of Jesus. And then Jesus has Thomas by the wrist guiding him to that side. And in some respects, the attempt by the painter, and I think it's pretty accurate to what you might have experienced there in John 20, and that is a sense of fear, wonder, disbelief, but eventually completely melting into belief and commitment. We do know the rest of the story about Thomas as a very dedicated apostle. So in some respects, we see doubt as not a problem. We see doubt as an individual who has already said, I'm willing to go and die, but I'm not going to go and die until I see it for myself, because I'm pretty convinced that I'm going to pay the ultimate price, which he does. So there's some great principles there. And as I've pointed out before, the end of each one of these chapters has a prayer and then some questions for discussion and reflection. But I thought it would be good, since everybody knows the story of Martha and Mary, but that's on the issue of grieving. So you certainly could have dealt with everything from hospitality and learning, but the whole grief issue is one that you've already alluded to, Timothy, that you've gone through. And this was a second time where you could come back to this issue of grief, in addition, of course, your chapter on Jacob to address that. So it was not only something you could write about intellectually, you were going through it emotionally as well, weren't you?
Yeah, and this has also touched a pretty deep nerve in groups that I've spoken to about this. What if grief could become an arena for us knowing God better? Mm-hmm. We often, in American culture in particular, really kind of want to push grief off. When bad things happen, grief is viewed as an enemy. And what I'm trying to do is to say, what if grief actually is a space that can teach us something about God that we wouldn't have been able to know otherwise? And could we get to know God better through grief? And it seems like Martha and Mary have two different responses to grief.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me to look at Jesus's response in the midst of the loss of their brother Lazarus, that this is the only time in John's gospel where the phrase "come and see" is used to invite Jesus to come and see something. It's a fascinating flip. That phrase shows up multiple times in John's gospel, but usually it's about coming to see Jesus or where Jesus is staying. It's an invitation toward Jesus. And in this case, it is Mary who flips that question on its head. And Jesus asks Mary, "Where have you laid Lazarus?" And she says, "Well, come and see." And what I think Mary is doing there is inviting Jesus into the heart of her grief. And we learn some profound things about the nature of God through Jesus's grief response there that I don't know that we would have been able to access without Mary's invitation into grief. And so I've been pondering these days, what might it look like for us to invite Jesus into our grief, and how might we learn about the heart of God as we do that? And I think Mary teaches us that virtue. Rather than putting grief off, is it possible that we could invite Jesus into our grief and see what happens as a result of that?
Let's begin for just a minute, talk about how people can learn more from you. We have a link to timothyrgaines.com. You don't have to remember all that because we have the link there. There's information about your books. There's information about your blog. You also have a place where people can sign up for resources. You even have something which I thought was very well done, a 3-minute theology, so that if you maybe would like just a short understanding of a particular theological clip, that would be the case. But it seems to me that people can either sign up for your resources or even begin to check out your blog, and you spend some time interacting on many of these very important issues.
Indeed. Yeah, I've got some blog posts that I hope come from more of a pastoral perspective and engage the content that's in this book. But again, it is accessible for anyone if you want to read it by yourself or if you want to read it with a small group. In many ways, these principles are going to be helpful for not just students of academic theology, but for anybody who's seeking to know God more deeply.
Well, I appreciate you, first of all, writing the book. Thank you for giving us an hour today to discuss it, especially given the fact that you are a busy professor and father and husband and all sorts of other things that are part of your life. So we appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
Very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Again, Timothy Gaines, if you would like to know a little bit more, it's Timothy R. Gaines, but you don't have to remember that. Simply go to the website, pointofview.net. You can see his picture there, and then click on the one that talks about the viewpoints and our website and all of that. You will see information about his books, his blog. You can sign up for some resources. Love this little piece here on 3-minute theology. There's also a place where you can chat, so if you would want to ask a question, you could do so. Then underneath it, we have information about walking the theological life, and it is something that's been out about a year, so maybe you'll be able to find it in your bookstore, probably not. So that's why we always make it easy for you to order it, in this case, either in paperback or Kindle. It's a great resource, and it's one that I think you would enjoy going through individually, because it's a great way to explore, if you will, theology vicariously through the lives of biblical characters. But if you would want to go through it as a group, as he's pointed out before, at the end of every one of these dozen chapters is a prayer and a series of questions that can stimulate the discussion. So however you want to use it, I think we can really have theology come alive in our lives through the lives of these biblical characters. And you've been listening to Point of View.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now. Or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, let's see if we can get into some other issues. First of all, we'll have a piece by Cal Thomas, which is titled Maduro's Downfall. I think it's worth just at least one more look at what has happened in Venezuela, the political and economic implications that this will have, plus the actual indictment that has come down against Nicolas Maduro. So I do want to get into that. Then we'll get into a piece that appeared in USA Today, which really looks at two issues. Number one, the incredible military success of Operation Absolute Resolve. Now, again, I mentioned some of that yesterday, but it's worth a revisiting of this, because you've had some incredible comments being made by people in the military who understand how significant this was, how many times something could have gone awry, and how incredibly successful it was. So that's the first part of the piece in USA Today. The second part is asking, again, a really troubling question. Why are Democrats against removing a dictator? Well, I think the answer probably is because it was done under the Trump administration. If it was done under Barack Obama, I doubt there'd be a peep. Matter of fact, there'd probably be celebrations, but we'll see. We'll get into that in just a few minutes. And then later, I think it's about time to look at a couple of other issues that are not related to Venezuela directly, and that is the back and forth between Mark Kelly, that would be Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona, and of course Pete Hegseth, that would be of course the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, about censure. I have found quite a few articles. I remember one in The Nation that spent all of its time using that to criticize Pete Hegseth and say some things about him which frankly were factually untrue, and say he was unqualified and all that. And then I've seen some others that referred to Mark Kelly as nothing more than a seditionist. But I found a piece in the Wall Street Journal I think does a better job of helping us understand the different issues there as well. And then if Venezuela was not enough, after Venezuela, the president talked about Greenland again. So I thought, okay, maybe it's time to talk about that. Rich Lowry's written a good piece on Don't Annex Greenland. And if nothing else, I just want to help you understand why, if it could happen, that we would have any control, even if it wasn't full control, even if it was just a territory, even if we were able to set up operations there. It is strategic for a variety of reasons. And again, I think Rich Lowry does a good job of saying, look, we're not supposed to do this. It's not going to probably happen, but let's not dismiss this without at least understanding the significance of Greenland, which has not been that significant in the modern world, but because of unique sets of circumstances become more unique. So we'll try to cover some of these, and as usual, some of these are pretty controversial. So at any point, if you want to join the conversation, feel free to do so. But let's, if we can, take a little bit of time to remind ourselves what we have. And Cal Thomas, good friend, has been on the program with us before, said Venezuelans are celebrating in the streets of Caracas and around the world after U.S. forces staged a flawless removal of a brutal dictator and narco-trafficker, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife. I did, by the way, yesterday talk a little bit about the vice president, who's now the president, and I've seen some people say as much as she's involved in much of this, and there certainly could be reason to want to remove her if that was possible, the fact that she has such expertise in energy production and the issue of oil, maybe that holds out the possibility that we can work with that individual at least for a time until we have an election, which I'll get to in just a minute. Even so, Cal Thomas goes into the second paragraph to say, look, even the Washington Post, which is no fan of President Trump and most of his policies, spoke well of the operation that captured Maduro, calling the action a major victory for American interests, and noting just hours before, supportive Chinese officials held a chummy meeting with Maduro, who has also been propped up by Russia, Cuba, and Iran. Well, 3 cheers, or at least 2 cheers for the Washington Post for stating the obvious, which we talked about yesterday. As I pointed out before, some people say, well, it was all about oil. Well, not all about, but it was about oil, and more, not so much we get oil as much as we want to see if we can prevent China, Cuba, Russia, Iran, some of them from benefiting from some of the things that have happened there. China benefiting from the oil, Cuba certainly benefiting from the oil, Iran and Russia from the sales back and forth. Anyway, all that is part of that issue. And then it goes on to talk about the fact that it seems like right now some of the people that have been protesting in the streets are on the wrong side of some of this. But he says it's useful, he says, to read the first sentence of the federal indictment against Nicolas Maduro. And we did not do that yesterday. So let me read this because I think you can understand where this trial is going. The sentence says, quote, "For over 25 years, leaders of Venezuela have abused their position of public trust and corrupted once legitimate institutions to import tons of cocaine into the United States." Now, the indictment goes on further from that, but nevertheless, it gets into the whole issue of what that has meant in terms of this country. Of course, we talked about the 8 million that have left Venezuela, the fact that I held up yesterday. Maybe I need to do that again just to illustrate the point. A 1 million bolivar, and it's not worth the paper it's printed on probably, but nevertheless, this is what happens when a socialist mindset takes over. And again, he goes on later and says the Washington Post editorial got it right when it said Maduro's removal sends an important message to tin pot dictators in Latin America and the world. Trump follows through. President Joe Biden offered sanctions relief to Venezuela, and Maduro responded to that show of weakness by stealing an election. So just a couple of key issues there as well. He also then goes on and quotes from Maria Machado, who is, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who said, "The time for freedom has come. Maduro will face international justice for atrocious crimes against Venezuelans and against citizens of many other nations." He goes on to remind us of what I talked about yesterday. Edmundo Gonzalez, who was the opposition candidate, actually won 70% to 30%. I think I looked up, it looked like it was 68-something%, but would have won by a greater margin if the election had been fair. And then just points out, as we'll talk about after the break, you have people marching in the streets with the Free Maduro signs. Please. And, of course, then he also ends by saying that President Trump says that the United States and oil companies will run Venezuela for an unspecified period of time, but, and here's the but, that will only work with the support of the military and the Venezuelan people, who, again, Donald Trump says will become rich after the removal now of Maduro and the opportunity for energy and oil production to flow. So, nevertheless, that is a piece by Cal Thomas. I gave you kind of a short summary of it, but if you'd like to read his 4 pages, great material, I guess 3 pages actually, that is available on the website. We'll come back, though. If you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Pundits and politicians have spent decades lamenting the erosion of the middle class. They point to rising prices in America while many jobs were being sent overseas. While some in the middle class improved their financial status and became part of the upper class, many more discovered that the goalposts moved. Compare 1975 to 2025. Families with an annual income of $100,000 5 decades ago were doing well. Today, $100,000 makes it difficult to survive. When the United States went off the gold standard in 1971, the money supply increased from less than $1 trillion in 1975 to $22 trillion in 2025. While it is true that the population increased, the money supply grew 4 times faster than the population. That is correct. It meant that every dollar you earned was competing with a flood of money that was slowly devaluing the dollars in your pocket. Sometimes the flood of money came quickly. In 2008, we had a banking and housing crisis. Congress and the Federal Reserve swooped in to save banks by printing money. In 2020, we had a pandemic and lockdown. Once again, money printing was supposed to save Americans, but it was also devaluing the dollars in your pocket. Median household income in 1975 was $11,000 and rose to $83,000 in 2025. That increase in 5 decades looks good until you compare it to the rising costs due to the devalued dollar. Put simply, wages have underperformed during this period. The solution to this middle-class meltdown is to fix the money and thereby fix the economy. This 50-year comparison illustrates what's been happening in our world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Georgia first and talk to Barbara. Thank you for calling today.
Hello.
Hey.
Just wanted to point out something you had mentioned concerning Trump and wanting to annex Greenland. I find it interesting. Have you heard of the Club of Rome? In Rome, the globalist organization.
That goes back to the 1970s. Boy, we haven't talked about that in a long time. You know, limits to growth and the idea of having the 10 regions of the world and using, at that time, the concern about, they didn't call it climate change back there, but environmental issues, running out of petroleum and things like that to justify kind of what today you have with the World Economic Forum. But finish the rest of that.
Well, what I find interesting, if you were to look up that map, Trump is actually fighting towards region number 1, which would include Greenland, Canada, and the United States. Plus, if you look even further, this is so much biblical prophecy, it appears to be, that also Trump is working towards the board of peace. He's saying he's going to have 10 to 12 representatives from different areas. And I'm thinking in terms, are these the 10 kings without kingdoms that rule with the Antichrist for an hour? It just seems like Trump is instrumental in bringing this globalist agenda.
Isn't that something? Because we used to say that more about the Bush administration. I think still, I take him at his word, America first, which in some respects he's looking at that in terms of the benefit of Greenland. And since you brought it up, I'll talk about it for just a minute. But we will get to it a little bit later the hour, because there are some obvious reasons. One is just the geostrategic nature of Greenland today. Greenland, first of all, I need to help people understand, if you're watching online, I got this little map here to show you that oftentimes when you see what's called the Mercator projection, you will find that Greenland looks like it's the size of Africa. No, but it's certainly the size of about a third of the United States. But more to the point, its location is very significant because now, because of the fact that it is warmer, we don't have as much Arctic ice. So there is probably going to be a lot more significance in terms of the fact that the Arctic Sea is navigable. And so there are maybe even natural naval lanes between the Atlantic and the Arctic that are developing. Of course, that gets into, everything from critical materials, of which there are many apparently in Greenland, as are there in Venezuela. And then, of course, possibly even fossil fuels. So would it be possible, and I'll get to it a little bit later, to actually have access to that or develop it in such a way? Denmark is not thrilled about it. But, Barbara, you raise a good question. I've not heard anybody make the connection between the Club of Rome and some eschatology in a while, so we'll do a prophecy program on that again, and that's a question I'll ask. But for those of you that are younger, you probably have never heard of the Club of Rome, so I checked it out. You can, I guess, find at least a Wikipedia, not that that's always accurate, but this was a group of individuals that gathered together and were running computer simulations at the time in which they were coming to erroneous conclusions, because unfortunately, garbage in, garbage out. Wrong assumptions lead wrong conclusions. And there was an argument that we're going to run out of oil. That doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. Going to run out of maybe even run out of food. There'll be population crises. Anyway, the Club of Rome was wanting to establish some kind of global network. And, of course, we've, over the years, have seen presidents flirt with the idea of a new world order. That's George Herbert Walker Bush and some others. And I think I mentioned Club of Rome in one of my booklets, but Barbara, I appreciate you bringing that up. That's maybe a topic we need to get into, because all of our listeners, probably under the age of 40, have probably never heard of the Club of Rome, and maybe we need to do some education on that. So I appreciate that. But let's see if we can just get to the other article I was mentioning, because in USA Today, Nicole Russell points out that, first of all, we have seen the deposing of Nicolas Maduro, and that has been an economic crisis. We've, of course, had human rights abuses, of course, undermining all sorts of democracy and things like that. So she said, I'm cheering with the Venezuelans both here and abroad about that, but then spends a little bit of time reminding us of the fact that this military endeavor has been very successful. It is Operation Absolute Reserve. And let me just quote from some people that probably know a whole lot more about this than any of us, and that would be Air Force General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said, I'm impressed with the planning and foresight and flawless execution, which involved more than 150 aircraft launched from 20 bases around the Western Hemisphere, including F-35s, F-52 jets, and B-1 bombers. And for that to have taken place is pretty amazing indeed. And I think it's just something that we have mentioned, and it's worth mentioning again, because we've had two very successful military operations. One, the bombing of the nuclear facility in Iran. The second, of the capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife. and both of those have been essentially flawless in their execution, and thus I think illustrate that the U.S. military is still a force to contend with in that regard as well. She goes on, of course, reminds us of the fact that even though he lost the election, he still stayed in power, which is an important point, because when some people say it's not constitutionally proper or even in terms of international law, and I do have an article we're going to talk about tomorrow in the Thursday program about the issue of international law, you are not allowed to abduct people that are rightly elected, but this is an individual that was not. And so certainly that is the case. And then she also has some sections on just how crazy it is that you have a number of people that have questioned Donald Trump, questioned whether or not the attack was appropriate, and then points out that the same scrutiny was not applied to Presidents Joe Biden and Barack Obama during their terms. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama did not receive explicit permission for any military operation which killed Osama bin Laden, but that was applauded, and the law authorization for use of military force was given back from the 9/11 terrorist attacks, but here you go in that regard. And some of the same people protesting it are people like President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris that offered $25 million for information leading to the arrest of Maduro. So I think you can see that maybe there are some issues that we will certainly be talking about as well. But let me take another phone call real quickly. We'll go to California. KNLB. Kathy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, it's got to do more with than just the oil. It's got to do with global trade again. TBN, they had a really good one. It was called Death to the Dictator of Iran. And CRUX, U.S. targets China's radar, Russia's system in Venezuela. And the reason why this is so important, because we've had Hezbollah and Hamas on the southern shores of our nation.
Yes.
And this is all connected. The Houthis have started to evolve, and they're in Somaliland. And Somali, which is the Horn of Africa, which this is starting to evolve into what Revelations has been leading us up to. I'm not saying we're in Revelation. I'm just saying the actors are starting to come around.
Yep. Rearranging the various props for the final play is how I put it. They're moving some of the props around behind the curtains before the final curtain opens up. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, you also have to take in consideration what's been going on with the Houthis, Somalia. I mean, a lot of money that went from Minnesota went into Somalia, where they have Al-Shabaab. I mean, this is not just a little incident with Venezuela.
Nope, it isn't.
It's a worldwide issue.
And again, that was something I tried to explain yesterday, but let me mention it real quickly as well. Some people say it was only about oil, it's only about terrorism, it's only about drugs, it's only about China, it's only about Bitcoin, it's all of the above. I mean, in some respects, this is, as some people have said, maybe a chess move. I know some of our next generation roundtable people on Monday said, well, you know, it's almost like Donald Trump was playing chess. Well, people are playing checkers, but they're, to use a chess example, look at the whole board. And I think, Kathy, you're doing that. That makes a great deal of sense. We'll be right back.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, certainly want to say thank you to Barbara and Kathy for some of the things they put on the table. And as we were going to the break, I mentioned sometimes you think about a chess match, and I'm not a chess player. My brother was a very good one, part of the chess club and those kinds of things. But I learned some vicarious lessons. When you look at a chessboard, look at all the board. Sometimes you get focused on one or two pieces, and I'm afraid that has been the case oftentimes with some of the presidents, or many of them have just wanted to play defense. Donald Trump came in with a different kind of mindset. I want to play offense. Now, the last time I saw a president like that was Ronald Reagan. One time he even asked some of his military people, well, what can we do to actually make Russia weaker? And they all, well, we're just reacting to them. No, what can we do to force them off the table, if you will? And how can we win, basically, is the question. And when you come in with that mindset, you start looking around and saying, okay, we are going to have some real issues here in the 21st century. The nation that really is successful with AI, and that's the January issue of Outlook. So if you haven't obtained your copy of that, means maybe you're not a regular monthly donor, but if you ask us for one, I'm sure we'll be glad to give you an extra copy that we have laying around here, because AI, artificial intelligence, is key. But how do you get there from here? Well, first of all, you need energy. Well, one of the ways you can limit China is to limit the amount of energy they can use to develop AI and even to develop their country. And when, as I pointed out the other day, 2/3, I looked it up, 68% of all the oil sold by Venezuela went to China. So obviously something has changed rather dramatically with the capture of Nicolas Maduro. There are also some other issues as well, in addition to oil, and one of those is rare earths. Rare earths are very necessary for military, and we now have opened another rare earths mine. I think we had one before, now I think we have two in the United States. Nothing, basically. And that has been a stranglehold that China has on us. Well, there are rare earths in Venezuela, also rare earths in Argentina. We've developed some great relationships with them. And most likely lots of rare earths in Greenland, which we'll get to in a minute. Again, for those of you that want to see this slide, I show you that if you look at the typical flat Mercator projection, Greenland looks like it's larger than North America, larger than Africa. It's really not. Here in the red, for those of you watching online, can actually see that what we are dealing with is something about the third of the size of the United States. But is that certainly going to be helpful? Yes, it is. Of course, you also have the issue of the hemisphere. 8 million people in Venezuela have left. Let's hope some of them are wanting to return, as maybe the value of their currency for the first time is there. Then we were, of course, talking about how this relates to other areas around the world. We talked about the money, which is well documented, that went from Minnesota, of all places, all the way to Somalia. And so, of course, we're talking about the Houthis there. And we've been talking about not only that, but you've had Hamas and Hezbollah in Venezuela. And you might say, well, who's your source for that? Well, none other than Maria Corina Machado. She is the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, who the other day in an interview, and I've been thinking about grabbing that interview and playing it, but I can give you a quicker summary in which he said, look, people have been talking about we shouldn't invade Venezuela. Well, we've been invaded by Russian agents, Iranian agents. We have terrorist groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, operating freely. Next door, of course, they have Colombia, and so we also have Colombia guerrillas. We have drug cartels, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and this has affected, as she said, 60% of the population, and Venezuela has become a criminal hub of the Americas. Her words, not ours. So it illustrates, again, another reason to be involved. Well, also, there have been others that have pointed out not only the rare earths, there's gold, but there's also digital gold. There are rumors that actually Nicolas Maduro and his cronies have about $600 billion worth of Bitcoin, or 600,000 Bitcoin. And again, that rumor may not be true, but it certainly seems valid because on chain, some people can at least identify tens of thousands, but not hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin. So maybe that's the case. So there's just all sorts of things that are why our involvement in Venezuela is significant. Well, then what about Greenland? And I think Rich Lowry did a good job of being fair, in which he said China, Russia, and Iran had to be alarmed by the display of U.S. power in Venezuela, but so did Denmark, the NATO ally of the United States. Because in the aftermath of capturing Nicolas Maduro, Trump spoke to the Atlantic about his other foreign policy priorities. We do need Greenland. Absolutely, he said. Now, again, you might just say, well, that's just one of those things the president sometimes says. As Rich Lowry says, Trump doesn't always do everything he says, but almost everything he does do, he talks about openly beforehand. And so just to give you some history, Denmark controls Greenland right now as a semi-autonomous territory. It colonized this sparsely populated island several hundred years ago. Most of it is within the Arctic Circle, so it isn't exactly the most desirable real estate by any typical metric, he points out, except near the coast. However, as more, and he's pointing out, this again is Rich Lowry, as more waters become navigable in the Arctic Sea, the top of the world opens up for greater geopolitical contention. Greenland occupies a crucial spot. It sits on a key naval lane between the Atlantic and the Arctic, and it has prodigious reserves of critical minerals, maybe even fossil fuels. The problem, as Rich Lowry points out, it's currently not available. What are the other options? Well, militarily we could take it. He says a lightly armed contingent of Americans crossing, a contingent of U.S. crossing guards probably could take it in a couple of days. The challenge, though, is political and diplomatic, not military. It is a NATO ally, and you think about what a kind of turmoil would be unfolding if a NATO ally, in one way or another, was actually taking another land held by another NATO ally. That'd be the United States and Denmark. Would Denmark invoke Article 5 against the United States? It's a making of a good spoof musical, but not something anybody really wants to experience. So the question is this. Would Donald Trump push this issue and force Denmark and NATO into a corner? Or is there a possibility for some kind of negotiation? Given the national strategic importance of rare earths to the U.S. and NATO, it certainly would be possible to think about unlocking the minerals there in Greenland. It doesn't necessarily mean that the United States needs to be there other than just to be allowed to have some companies that I think would have a better technological ability to mine those than individuals in other parts of the world. Instead of clapping back to Donald Trump, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen should be reaching out for a steak dinner at Mar-a-Lago and offering a deal, while public pressure gets Trump's back up private persuasion and a warm relationship goes a long way. The Panamanians managed to get Trump to stop talking about taking back the canal, at least for now, and that is at least his recommendation there. But if you, as we talked about just a few minutes ago, begin to think about the strategic alliances and the geographical significance of some of this, whereas before the top of the world was sort of barren and hardly ever considered, now because of a warming climate in part, there are navigable lanes there. And as a result, on the other side, of course, is China. And in the distance, of course, could even be China, but certainly Russia is the big issue right now. And of course, there are very significant issues of, indeed, if you have a mindset, which Donald Trump does, of America first, and as a real estate mogul, saying, well, there's some land and there's some resources, let's see if we can get them, and thus enhance the operation of the United States. So as we've pointed out before, if this all catches you off guard, I would recommend that you go to the website, pointofview.net, and scroll down. You will see my Viewpoints commentary today is about the middle class meltdown. But if you go a little further, there's a grayed area that says, see more viewpoints. And the second one, the one I did yesterday, was on the national security strategy, in which I point out that the Trump administration has been very clear about what they want to do. And there are some very significant statements being made, of course, about Venezuela and also about Greenland. And you can find some of that in the national security strategy. And you can also read a summary of it in my commentary on Point of View. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to be looking a little bit at the year of 2025, and Robert Knight is with us talking about some of the good news and positive news about that. Also going to be talking about with Chris Reese some of the New Year's resolutions. I also will get into this whole issue of are we ever violating international law? We'll get into that detail in part because I'm sure we'll also revisit that on Friday when we have our friends from First Liberty Institute on the roundtable. So lots to cover. But I thought before we're done, I should at least say something about this dust-up, and it's more than that now, the proposed censure of Senator Mark Kelly by the Defense Secretary or the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. First of all, these are good people that have served in the military. I always hate it when we are critical of one another. The enemy's not here. It's out there. And I've struggled to even find a good article. I've got one in front of me here, the seditionist Kelly. But even there, to give credit, this individual is very critical, says, first of all, Mark Kelly did, by all accounts, serve our nation with honor and distinction. And as a matter of fact, it goes on to even talk about that and does talk about the response from Mark Kelly, who after 25 years in the U.S. Navy, 39 combat missions, 4 missions to space. I risked my life for my country and defend my Constitution, including the First Amendment rights of every American to speak out. Of course, he earned the right and retirement, but again, we get into all that. Of course, his wife, Gabby, you can go through all of those issues, which I'll at least give credit to. Even this person is very critical of Mark Kelly, who at least acknowledges his service. On the other side, on the liberal side, there was one in Nation who was just horrible that was doing nothing but using that as a justification to say just a lot of outrageous things about Pete Hegseth. And so I was looking for something that at least understands the circumstance and has just at least a little bit of balance. And lo and behold, I found it at the Wall Street Journal. The editors put it this way. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the Pentagon is looking to punish retired Navy captain and now Arizona Democratic Senator Mark Kelly. His offense? appearing in a partisan social media video warning troops not to obey illegal orders. This episode reflects well on nobody, and it will further poison the chances of a national defense consensus the country needs. Mr. Kelly isn't innocent here. He and 5 other Democratic lawmakers with military intelligence backgrounds last year produced a video montage speaking directly to the members of the military. And so you've got, enough blame, if you will, to go around, but they go on to say, look, that was a mistake. They say Senator Kelly thinks so little of his fellow officers to suggest so casually that they might carry out illegal orders. They say the senator knows better than to sow doubt about the chain of command in the minds of young soldiers and officers. U.S. military officers have to make snap judgment, real-time judgments with imperfect information. What they need from Washington is confidence that both parties will back up decisions made in good faith, not exploit officers and their missions to score points against the partisan opposition as well. The Democratic video, they say, was a bad look with a short online half-life. And, of course, now you have Secretary Hegseth promising to do something that looks like retribution. And I'm not sure we're well served by that either. But nevertheless, Mr. Hegseth, they say, has now issued a formal letter of censure that will be put into Mr. Kelly's military personnel file. And the Pentagon has begun proceedings that would cost the senator his captain's rank and pension. Senator Kelly vowed to fight the proceedings, and don't be surprised if he keeps his pensions on the merits. And I hope so, because we may disagree with what he said. I don't think what he said and what some of the others did is helpful, but nevertheless, this does look a lot like retribution. I thought it was interesting just the other day that when you start talking about serving with distinction, one of the people that used that phrase used it in another way that I'd never thought about, and that's where the retired Navy SEAL and podcaster Jocko Willink was on Sean Hannity's program, and he referred to, again, Senator Kelly as a guy who served with distinction, which is true, but then went on to say that's why this is even more troubling, because in a sense, if you look back, as he was saying, through the military career of Mark Kelly, which has been exemplary, you can't find any instance of him attempting to undermine the terminal end of his chain of command, which makes what he did a few weeks ago so jarring and, as some people said, so unfortunate, unlawful. Of course, some say seditious and treasonous and all the rest. But let's go back to the piece by the Wall Street Journal, because what they say is the larger issue here is to the country. The Trump administration maybe not want to hear this, but they need allies across the aisle in Congress if it is serious about fixing U.S. shipbuilding or expanding weapons production. America's real enemies are challenging U.S. interest across the world, and that's who voters want the Trump Pentagon to focus on, not on Senator Mark Kelly. So I thought it was about as good a piece as you're going to find where, again, if it's this particular dust-up and finger-pointing between Pete Hegseth and Mark Kelly, or even the reaction yesterday to the 5-year anniversary of January 6th, it's almost hard to find anybody who's at least willing to settle on the facts of some of these cases. And I think it's just a great illustration of why we have to be really discerning. And even one of my articles tomorrow, which we'll get into in some detail, requires us to have some discernment when you're even looking at reports that come from a White House correspondent, trying to, in some respects, filter everything from, in this case, his, but it could be his or her worldview. And so I hope that that's why you would appreciate what we try to do here on Point of View. Yesterday, I tried to give you some basic information about Venezuela. So I'm starting with the beginning. It's twice the size of California. It has 28, almost 29 million people. Used to be the richest country. How did we get here? Well, I took you through some of the history of Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro and the election and all of that. I talked about what the military has done, and we once again wanted to salute those people in the military. We talked about whether or not this is constitutional in light of Article 2, which is certainly very important, giving the president of the responsibility as commander-in-chief. But, of course, Article 1, to declare war, which we have only done twice in the 20th century and only a few times in the 19th century and never since then. And that's, I think, a concern there as well. And then try to just look at reasons for the action and, most importantly, what might happen in the future, because these people that are still in Venezuela have suffered a great deal. Those who left had to start all over again, and this is a country that had great potential, and it illustrates only so well what happens when people take control with a socialist or communist agenda and what that can mean not only to the people, but to a country just to the south of the United States. When you don't like neighbors that are causing a lot of problems, you want to see if you can get rid of the neighbors. And that's kind of what has been taking place over this last week. Let's take a break, though. We have certainly a lot to cover tomorrow, and we will do so. But first of all, I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the book we talked about last hour, Walking the Theological Life, all available at the website at pointofview.net. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.